Can Australia actually change its emissions trajectory so that it's aligned with the Paris targets? That is going to be the key question this year in 2021. Australia is facing a huge amount of heat from many of the world's governments for lacking action and ambition on climate change. And this question is coming up again and again, and it's only going to come up even more as we get closer to a really big climate conference at the end of the year in Glasgow. So we can answer this question in a bunch of different ways. Of course, the first question is, what is the target? Australia is, of course, being pressured to aim for net zero emissions by 2050. This figure, that 2050 year, comes from a global average. Of course, Australia has already eaten up so much of its emissions budget that to keep the world under a global warming of around 1.5 degrees Celsius, this should be sooner, probably by 2040. And we can actually put that on a chart. It looks something like this. Now, how well is Australia actually doing? Well, we actually have an idea of that too. So, every year, Australia's government releases a bunch of emissions projections. So if we look at now and we look at projecting out into the next 10 years, what is projected to happen for Australia? Is Australia aligned with that Paris target? And of course, the answer is no, it's not. Australia's emissions are projected to fall very slowly over the next 10 years. And we can also take those projections over the next 10 years and take a rough guess of when, if we assume that rate of reductions, when Australia will actually hit net zero emissions. And unfortunately, that is 2294, which is somewhat further in the future than the year 2035 or 2040, which is when Australia would have to reduce its emissions down to zero to align with the most ambitious part of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So part of the way that the Australian government has actually been trying to sell its current levels of inaction is by taking historical emissions in Australia and presenting them as if they're actually more successful than they really are. And one of the ways that it's been doing this is by including this controversial sector known as the land use sector. And if you look at it on a graph, you can actually see that if you include land use, then Australia's emissions look a lot better than if you don't. Of course, in the year 2020 and of course in the year 2021 as well, there will be some impact from COVID-19, which puts Australia in a slightly better position. But that is not a systemic change. That is not a government policy. And so that is not something that we can rely on. And in fact, what you're going to see over the course of this year is Australia's emissions start to rise quite significantly because, as we know, there has been no systemic change and no real change in policy in Australia looking at emissions. This is only going to get worse and worse as time goes on. And what we're also going to see is that Australia's very bad track record on emissions and its very bad projections on emissions are going to be defended using a bunch of rhetorical tricks. So that means comparing Australia to other countries, not using like-for-like data. It means messing around with emissions numbers so that you include things like population and GDP. None of these really matter to the world's climate because, of course, it's emissions, the raw number, the absolute quantity of the substance that drives the very heart of this problem. And that is something that we're going to have to really focus on. If you want to keep up with coverage of this, please have a look at what we're writing on Renew Economy, because this is where we really dig into the numbers and we try to take everything apart for you. Last week, there was a major summit, the Biden Climate Summit, and Australia was really bringing out all the stops for this. And so have a peek there. We've broken it all down for you. It's really, really interesting. And I hope that you enjoy reading. Thanks.